Juan Soto had his introductory press conference for the New York Mets. A couple of Mets targets are off the board. Could they be interested in signing Roki Sasaki? And could they be one of the favorites? All of that and more on today's edition of the Bleav in Mets podcast. Chris Schubert, Jack McKessie back with you here once again. We waited just an extra day because we knew the Juan Soto press conference was going to happen, and we didn't want to have to put out two shorter episodes. We decided to do one big, longer episode here at the end of the week. Jack, a lot has happened since we last did a pod, a lot of stuff that impacts the New York Mets. How are you, my friend?
I'm good. There's a lot of news in the National League, particularly in the National League Central. And Chris, if I had one thing to take away from Juan Soto's introductory press conference, it's that I think he could fit in really well with the Fast and Furious cast because it's all about the family man.
This man is a family man. This man is ready to build a dynasty, and this man is a New York Met. BetOnline continues to be the world's most trusted betting platform and your number one source for online betting. From the earliest odds to in-game live betting, BetOnline provides you with all the action and the ability to watch the games as they happen. With the largest selection of odds on everything from football, the NBA, and college basketball, NHL to UFC, head on over to BetOnline today, and don't forget to use our promo code BLEAV, that's BLEAV, for your welcome bonus on your first deposit. BetOnline, the game starts here. I don't have a ton more to add to Juan Soto's introductory press conference. It was the moment where it all became real that Juan Soto is a New York Met, that you heard from Steve Cohen, you heard from David Stearns, you heard from Scott Boras, you heard from Juan Soto, and you just saw the effort that was put together by everybody involved at that table to make this happen, to get this over the finish line, and you could tell that it was something very important to Steve Cohen to make this signing happen, to convince the world that the New York Mets are a different operation with him in charge. And this was the move that he had been planning and waiting on for years to launch a new era for the New York Mets. And the Steve Cohen era up until this point has been a lot of fun, but my big takeaway now that Juan Soto is in the fold is I think we're about to start a new chapter, and not just in terms of the players that get signed, but in terms of what this organization looks like top to bottom, and that is very exciting.
Yeah, I think one of my big takeaways from the introductory press conference was how influential Steve Cohen, not just Steve Cohen, but his entire family were in getting this operation running, because he shouted out his father-in-law, Alex's dad, Ralph, who made the trip as a 94-year-old man to California to meet Juan Soto and tell him how important it was as a Mets fan to have someone like that on the roster. Obviously, Alex Cohen herself is, a big part of what this Mets team community aspect is kind of built around, because she's very hands-on with the family stuff that each player has to deal with, and Soto was very receptive to that as well. And then we also heard about Steve Cohen's son, who was part of the creative team that put together the recruitment video for Soto, which, Chris, I don't know if you saw this, but I think it was in The Athletic. Someone reported that the video that they made for Juan Soto, it was either The Athletic or ESPN, said that they showed a full hype video about what he could do in Queens, and they ended with the statue of Tom Seaver and then a render of a statue of Juan Soto next to him outside Citi Field. That's pretty powerful stuff.
Yeah, I mean, because that's the track that we're on right now. That's how good of a player Juan Soto is. And when you spend 15 years of your career in one place with the idea of winning not just one but multiple championships during your tenure, that's how you get a statue out front, and that's how you get your number retired. Like David Wright's going to get his number retired later this year on July 19th. I am already attempting to plan a way to get to that game.
Me too.
I don't live in New York, so it would require some cross-country travel, but I am ready to make the journey for that July 19th game, to be in attendance and cry with 45,000 of my closest friends as we watch David Wright put number 5 up into the rafters and never be worn again. That's my childhood, and so I'm going to do everything in my power to be there. No.
Neither of us live in New York. I'd love if we both ended up there, if we were able to meet up and maybe create some extra content for the pod. It would be a really fun time, I think. And obviously a really, really special day for David Wright and his family, and for the Mets and for us as fans.
Where do you want to start? You want to start with Garrett Crochet? You want to start with Max Fried? You want to start with Devin Williams, Kyle Tucker? What moves that we have not discussed? Because while the Mets are not directly involved in any of these moves, they do impact the New York Mets and their pursuits this offseason, because we know that the New York Mets are not done. The job is not finished. Steve Cohen said as much. David Stearns has said as much. There is work to be done. David Stearns is getting back to work, and There's starting pitching to acquire. There's relief pitching to acquire. There are more bats to add to this offense. There is stuff to do. And so what we've seen over the last couple of days since we last did a pod all directly impact the Mets' pursuits here the rest of the way.
I think we could start with maybe chronologically. I Bleav the Max Fried signing was the first news to come out of the Juan Soto signing. Max Fried went to the Yankees for 8 years. I don't have the number in front of me. $218 million, which is another indicator, Chris, that this starting pitching market is absolutely absurd.
Why do you think David Stearns is out here signing Frankie Montas? Why do you think he's out here signing Clay Holmes and making him a starter? Because David Stearns ain't interested in giving you 8 years. He ain't interested in giving you more than $200 million. It's not happening. And there's part of me that is hesitant to the way that the New York Mets are approaching putting together their rotation. There's also part of me that is maybe I'll coin a phrase here on this show. Maybe I'm David Stearns pilled because I hear the way that he talks about building a rotation, and I hear the way that they are going about this of like, why would we give long-term commitments to guys who arms fall off? Why wouldn't we try to get creative? If you know that throughout the year you're going to have to rotate through 7 or 8 guys, you can maybe take some flyers. You can Bleav in your development process. And again, maybe it's because David Stearns is my team's baseball executive and I'm just starting to Bleav in that philosophy, but like I'm starting to get on board with what they've done here. There is work to do, and they need to get a couple more starters before I feel completely settled. But I think I'm starting to come around with the approach that David Stearns is taking. And by the way, I kind of think that's why Sean Manaea isn't going to be here next year, because David Stearns is, I think, going to look in a different direction.
Yeah, it really feels like Sean Manaea is going to be able to demand upwards of $25 million a year. And I think because of these longer-term deals that are getting handed out, like the one to Max Fried, he might be looking for something a little bit heftier than the 2 years with an opt-out that the Mets gave him before last season. So it's going to be tough because when you look at the starting pitching market, a lot of the big names, and Sean Manaea, I would say, is one of the big names left, are going to be requesting contracts that stack up to Max Fried's or even surpass it in some cases. And with that being the case, and with, like you mentioned, David Stearns' unwillingness to hand out long contracts and, hefty, pricey ones, it's going to be really interesting to see what kind of small market tactics or mid-market tactics, no disrespect intended to Milwaukee, that David Stearns is able to use when he's building up this Mets rotation. And we've already seen, like we've talked about on this pod, and like you've already mentioned earlier, the Frankie Montas signing, the Clay Holmes signing, an experiment to bring him into the rotation from the bullpen. I don't expect the Mets to really be in on any of the big names remaining. I don't think they're in on Corbin Burns.
Nope.
I don't think they're in on Manaea, really. Like, it's going to be an interesting rest of the offseason. I think Walker Buehler is definitely in the cards because,
it'd be the dream.
It
would be the dream.
He's still one of those pitchers that I don't think will be able to get a long-term deal because of the lack of success in 2024. But it's going to be really interesting to see what solutions Stearns comes up with the way the market is shaping up through, a month and a half of action.
It's the easiest thing of all time to connect former Brewers executive David Stearns with former Brewers ace Corbin Burns, and yet you don't hear a peep that the Mets are even sniffing around that market. Yeah. Tells you everything they need to know, that you need to know about how they feel about the top end of this starting pitching market. It's why they were linked so aggressively to making a trade for Garrett Crochet, and maybe we can now segue into that. The White Sox ultimately did move on from Garrett Crochet. They made a deal with the Boston Red Sox, got 4 prospects back in return, and here's what I would say to Mets fans. If you want a Garrett Crochet and the White Sox, you could wave a magic wand and they would accept whatever offer you put in front of them, as long as it was comparable to what the Red Sox offered, then you could say goodbye to Jet Williams and Brandon Sproat, because that's what it would have required. That is the level of prospect that the Red Sox gave up in this deal. I don't think David Stearns was ever going to even entertain the idea of trading Brandon Sproat and Jet Williams for Garrett Crochet. This pod was a big proponent of trading for Garrett Crochet. He's 25 years old. He's a lefty. He does things that nobody else in the game currently does. He would have been the piece de resistance on the starting pitching side of things for the Mets this offseason. But they were never getting to that offer for the Red Sox. And I also wonder, and I've heard a lot of people talk about this, and it was a great point, The White Sox and their ownership were one of the few that rejected Steve Cohen's bid to become the owner of the New York Mets because they were afraid that Steve Cohen was going to spend like a drunken sailor and was going to put the sport in a really bad spot. And in the same offseason that they just gave $765 million to Juan Soto, I could imagine that dealing with the Red Sox, if you're David Stearns, the White Sox, I should say, is a little bit more difficult than it would be to deal with any other team. And so it just felt like there was never going to be a match, both because of the relationship the two teams have, because of the owners, and because of the prospect match that I don't think the Mets were interested in making that trade by giving up Jet Williams and Brandon Sprout. So here we are. Garrett Crochet's off the board. Big move for the Red Sox. And I will tell you the one thing that surprises me about that is they were major players for Burns. And so I don't know if that takes them off the table for Burns or if they're still going to be hot in pursuit of Burns to add with Crochet. If they are kind of done, that really limits Burns' market. And then I wonder if David Stearns tries to strike, if now all of a sudden Burns isn't looking for a 6, 7, 8-year deal the way that Max Fried just got $27 million and Burns is going to ask for 30 to 35. I wonder if the market kind of suppresses a little bit. The current prices tell me that that's not going to be the case, but that's the only way I see them going back to the Corbin Burns market. And with Crochet off the board, it's now Framber Valdez, it's Luis Castillo, it's Zach Gallen. Those are the options. Maybe Dylan Cease makes some sense. Those are the top end of the market starting pitchers that you could acquire via trade, now with Garrett Crochet off the board.
And the other thing to note here is that because of the Crochet trade, there is now an established value, I guess, on those kinds of pitchers that would be, under team control for maybe a little bit longer and on potentially on the trade block. It costs the Red Sox, a pretty decent haul of prospects. And I don't want to jump ahead too far, but the Yankees acquiring Devin Williams also cost them a pretty hefty price. And so I think for the Mets and for David Stearns, what's going to be interesting is whether they consider some of these other, potential tradable pitchers because of what it will cost the Mets farm system. And, the whole mission of Steve Cohen and David Stearns for at least a year and even predating Stearns has been building up the farm system to a respectable level where the Mets are able to keep bringing up homegrown talent and building a homegrown roster that is supplemented by some of these free agent names. And if you're spending, your top prospects like Sprout and like Jet Williams, other names, Blade Tidwell, whoever, to acquire a pitcher for, a couple more years of team control, that is antithetical to the mission to build up the rest of the farm system. And so I really wonder if, because of what the trade market now looks like, because of the Crochet trade, that free agency for some of the mid to lower tier starting pitchers is more what David Stearns will be looking at going forward. It'll be really interesting. Again, I really have no idea how it's going to shake out the rest of this offseason, but like you said, I don't think there's really any chance they're in on Burns or someone in that top tier unless the market comes way, way down.
Yeah, they're not in on Burns. They're not in on Flaherty. They're not going to give those multi-year deals beyond maybe 4 years that Burns and Flaherty are looking for. They're not going to play in those waters. But I think it's weird, right? Because I agree with the sentiment of, man, Jet Williams and Brandon Sprout would have been a lot to give up for Garrett Crochet, and we know what David's trying to build. We know what Steve's trying to build. They are trying to build the Dodgers. They're trying. And I want to maybe take off the table saying build Dodgers East. They're trying to build the New York Mets, and they're trying to build their version of that. They are trying to make the New York Mets a standard bearer in baseball. And part of that is, yes, we spend money. Yes, we have the top shelf talent, but we also develop top shelf talent to replace that top shelf talent as it continues to age. And that is a noble goal, and it is an important goal for them to be sustainable. But there's also part of me that wants to be like, you should have given up the prospects for Garrett Crochet because he's Garrett freaking Crochet. And you need to go out and get a starter this offseason anyway, and so you should have done it. And so I find myself battling those two thoughts because I know how important it is what they're trying to do, and I applaud them for doing so. But at the same time, it's like, I would hate to get to the end of the line here this offseason, and they don't make the necessary improvements to the rotation, and we are biting our nails and watching these games through our fingers because we have to watch Frankie Montas take the ball every fifth day in a really important spot. Or Clay Holmes, the experiment doesn't work. I just would like some more solidified options, and Garrett Crochet felt like the top of the top, and we'll see what goes from there. I think in timeline order, we have to discuss Devin Williams next. And it's Nestor Cortez, it's Caleb Durbin, it is cash going to the Brewers in exchange for Devin Williams. Here is my takeaway from this and how it impacts the New York Mets. The New York Yankees clearly are not getting the bites that they want on the trade market. See where Kyle Tucker ended up. We'll get to him in a second. They clearly, because this is what Brian Cashman does, he pivots to pitching. If something doesn't work on the hitting market, he pivots to pitching. Juan Soto signed with the Mets. He pivoted to Max Fried. We should have seen the writing on the wall when they traded Cortez and Durbin that they were not getting Kyle Tucker. They pivoted and said, okay, we're going to trade for Devin Williams now. We are going to be in the run prevention business now instead of the run creation business. And this, to me, says the price on the market for these guys in trades is higher than the Yankees are willing to pay, but also maybe free agency isn't going the way the Yankees want it to go by talking to Christian Walker or some of the other Anthony Santander, some of the other options that are out there for offense. And then that leads me back to the New York Mets. It's like, okay, they need at least 2 more bats in this lineup. They need to add some offense, and you wonder where it's going to come from if the market is this stiff. And you saw what the Cubs had to give up for Kyle Tucker. We'll get to that in a second. But I just wonder if we are going to see a very slow-moving offensive market right now because it feels like the Yankees are kind of the gauge on this, and the Yankees are kind of telling you the market isn't where they're comfortable.
I think that's a really good point because I was thinking while you were talking, there aren't a ton of hitters who have come off of the free agent market yet. I think we really expected Juan Soto would obviously be the biggest domino to fall, and then maybe there would be a cascading effect. But it seems really like owners and front offices around baseball are still trying to feel out what the market is for the remaining hitters that aren't named Juan Soto. Obviously, Soto is getting the biggest contract in sports history is not really the standard that they're looking to. It's not apples to apples, I should say, for whoever else is on the market. Alex Bregman, for example. And it's interesting that one of the biggest names offensively to have moved at all in this offseason now is Kyle Tucker, who was a trade move rather than a free agent signing. So I wonder what that means for the market on infielders, particularly first baseman or third baseman. Like I mentioned Bregman, you wonder what the Mets are looking at with Pete Alonso right now or what Christian Walker's deal might look like. I know Anthony Rizzo's also a free agent. He's been, having a couple of rough years, but the lack of offensive moves in this free agency so far has been really interesting, and I don't know, again, how that's going to shake out at all because all we've really seen is trades and pitching, largely, acquired by the Yankees.
9 players last year that are available in free agency this offseason on the offensive side had WARs above 3. So 3 or more WAR in 2024. Of those 9 players, 2 have signed. Juan Soto and Willy Adames. Jurickson Profar, Alex Bregman, Teoscar Hernandez, Anthony Santander, Carlos Santana, Christian Walker, Jock Peterson, all still available. That I didn't say Pete Alonso's name in there, a guy who only had a 2.1 WAR last year, but is one of the bigger names out there. So there is still a robust run creation market. There is still a robust offensive market that I think is very slow moving right now. You got a lot of guys that have the qualifying offer attached to them, and that's going to slow some teams down. I think somebody is waiting for somebody else to go through the wall first on these first basemen, and they're waiting to see what that price ultimately ends up being. And you saw, because, the Cubs gave up Isak Paredes and 2 prospects to go out and get Kyle Tucker, and I love that move for them. I love that move for them. That is a young lefty bat. I think it opens up the door for them to trade Cody Bellinger. Maybe that's something the Mets should be interested. Center field, first baseman, lefty bat to add to their lineup. Yeah. I think they're going to be more eager to move Bellinger now. And so I just think, to tie this back to the Mets here, it just feels like it is very slow. And it's frustrating because we were all just gearing up for Juan Soto, and then Juan Soto signed, and I think the expectation was, okay, let's keep going. Let's just have more moves. And it just doesn't feel like we're there yet. It doesn't feel like that's in the cards right now.
Yeah, I think one thing that's really intriguing, and I keep using the word interesting, but it is there are so many, like you mentioned, free agents, quality free agent hitters that are still out there, but then there are also a few other guys that could be moved. You mentioned Cody Bellinger. The Cubs have also been, tied to rumors that they might trade their second baseman, Nico Horner, who's another really solid bat that is a contact hitter guy, a guy that can, hit some doubles, not a ton of home runs, but like that piece of it, that piece of this offseason, could also influence how the rest of the free agent hitters market shapes up, because there are other potential trades on the way for bats around baseball, and particularly centered around the Cubs off the top of my head.
Yeah, so we'll see. I mean, they need 2 more bats. They need to solve this first baseman problem, and I still think they need another bat outside of there to serve as their DH. And there are different pathways that they can go depending on what they do someplace else. They have money to spend. They will spend money. You heard Steve Cohen in the press conference that, I'll leave the rest of the moves to David. Right? It felt like Soto was the thing that he needed to be involved in heavily because he was spending $765 million. And that's not to say that David Stearns wasn't on board, but when you're dealing with a unique free agent like this takes a organizational effort. And now I think Steve is going to be like, okay, I need to trust the group that got this team to the NLCS last year. They're going to tweak the rest of this roster. I'm going to let them do their thing, and David Stearns is going to get to work. One of the places that he could, they're putting together a presentation for this gentleman. We'll see if it leads to a meeting. Let's have the Roki Sasaki conversation. I have been hesitant to do it. I have been hesitant to discuss Sasaki at length. He was a member of my dream offseason. I never thought it was realistically possible for the Mets to be considered one of the major suitors for Sasaki, with Yamamoto and Ohtani going to the Dodgers. I thought that was a popular destination. The Padres and Yu Darvish, and Sasaki basically looking up to Yu Darvish. That felt like a place. All of the West Coast teams felt like they were in play. This just felt like a Seattle move, right? So that they can then trade Luis Castillo or one of their other starters. Like, it just felt like a move that they could make. And yet, we got a little just sprinkle of news that just makes you start to believe that the Mets could be interested. And the main thing is that apparently one of the things that Sasaki is really looking for is a place that has a decent pitching development plan for him. That is really important to him. That he wants to know that the place that he's going, he can trust to help him develop as a pitcher. And apparently his agency is very high on Jeremy Hefner as a landing spot for pitchers because of the work that he has done. And so Sasaki is apparently, these are the priorities for him: endorsement opportunities, winning, and pitching development. And I quote tweeted the tweet that had that information. And I said, endorsement opportunities, check, being in New York. Winning, team just went to the NLCS and signed Juan Soto, check. And then the third thing, pitching development, Jeremy Hefner has developed a brand here. And I said in the tweet, I still think he picks the Padres or the Dodgers. But if these are the things that are going to matter, the Mets will have a seat at the table. The Mets will have an opportunity. Their presentation that they send over to Roki Sasaki will lead to them being able to get a meeting. Because all 30 teams are going to submit a presentation. They'd be foolish to not. All 30 teams are not getting a meeting with Roki Sasaki and his agency. The New York Mets will be one of the teams that gets a meeting. If those 3 things that we have been told are apparently important to Sasaki and his team are true, the Mets will have a seat at the table, and that's all you can ask for. Because so far, it feels like Steve Cohen and David Stearns have a pretty decent sales pitch. They're pretty good at this.
Yeah, if you weren't going to bring it up, Chris, I was going to pitch it to you and let you, restate that content of your tweet right there, because I think that's such a good breakdown of how the Mets have pretty much everything that, according to Joel Wolf and the rest of Sasaki's team, that's the Mets have everything that he's looking for, right? You mentioned obviously the endorsement thing in New York and a team committed to winning. If Juan Soto signing with the Mets doesn't indicate that they're bought into winning $765 million, and Soto picking essentially the Mets over a team like the Yankees, who were just in the World Series, that's an amazing sign there. And then again, you look at what Jerry Hefner was able to do with guys like Sean Manaea, guys like Luis Severino, and guys like Jose Quintana. In the last couple of years, those guys have kind of rehabilitated their image and their reputation as pitchers, and we're in a position right now, as we've talked about already in this episode alone, where a guy like Luis Severino can sign the biggest contract in A's history, and a guy like Sean Manaea is in the top tier of remaining free agent pitchers on the market right now. And so that has to be something very, very intriguing for a 23-year-old making the switch from NPB to MLB, because you know that you're in good hands with a guy that is able to, even with guys who are later in their careers, turn them into a success story, how much could he do with someone who's 23 years old and gets to be built up by a professional pitching development lab like the Mets have right now in Queens?
Here is the last thing I want to say on Sasaki before we get out of here. I think the Mets have a chance to get Roki Sasaki. I think they're going to ultimately get a meeting with Sasaki and his agency and his team. I think Sasaki should be viewed as the cherry on top of what would be an excellent offseason, because this is not going to get done until after Christmas. The meetings aren't going to take place until then.
Probably
they only have until
January.
Right. This is the second or third week of January, right up against that January 23rd deadline is when this happens. So you do all the other work. You sign another 2 starters, you sign a bat, and then all of a sudden, if you get Roki Sasaki, you then worry about that problem later. You don't all of a sudden go, oh, you know what? We signed Walker Buehler and Sean Manaea. We're good. We're not going to pursue Roki Sasaki. No, you continue that pursuit, and then you all of a sudden can entertain some trade possibilities, or you just create some depth, or you take it slow with Sasaki. You let him just kind of maybe start in AAA. Not to say that I think that would be the ideal scenario. I think him starting in the majors would be where he should be, but I just think the New York Mets are not going to let the rest of their roster dictate whether or not they're in on Roki Sasaki. Roki Sasaki wanting to pick the Mets is going to determine whether or not the Mets are in or not. If the Mets are a contender, they're going to be a contender no matter what they do the rest of this offseason. That's the point I'm trying to make, is that they will be in this as long as Sasaki wants the Mets to be in this. If the Mets want to be in it, they will be in it. So that's where it's at.
I think for the next month, Chris, I'm going to be doing the deepest of dives in researching every single interaction Roki Sasaki has had with Kodai Senga and what kind of relationship they have. And I would love to know if there is some kind of rapport that dates back to NPB. There might not be anything there, but when I think of, what the Mets have in terms of a pull from the Japanese side of things, Kodai Senga is the obvious answer. And would love to know if there's any sort of connection there to exploit the same way that the Padres have with Yu Darvish, and obviously the Dodgers have with Yoshinobu Yamamoto and Shohei Ohtani.
I mean, it would just be absolutely insane if they were able to add Sasaki to this group. I mean, it would just be.
Sasaki and Soto are two of the best. They are the 2 best free agents on the market, frankly.
Yeah.
26-year-old power hitting right fielder who is among the best on base guys in the history of baseball, and a 23-year-old pitcher who is among the best prospects to ever come over from Japan, and one of the best pitchers in the history of national or NPB in Japan. They're the top 2 guys, and if the Mets get both,
I mean, it would be insane. It would be absolutely insane. But that is going to do it for us here on this edition of the Bleav in Mets podcast. Wanted to get back into the groove of things, recap everything that has happened. We'll be back with an episode over the weekend, maybe with some a refresh of maybe the new targets we want the Mets to go after. If there's any news that happens with the New York Mets, any signings, you'll obviously get that emergency edition of the show, so you can look forward to that over the weekend. Make sure you rate, review, subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts. If you search up Jack McKessie on YouTube, you can see the video version of the show over there as well, and we are soon to roll out some social media content, some short-form stuff on both the YouTube side of things and on TikTok. Just search Bleav in Mets on TikTok. But that is going to do it for us here on this edition of the show. We will be back over the weekend. Hope everybody has a good weekend. We will talk to you then. Let's go Mets.
Let's go Mets.